actually, the Rebbe says that the question begins, Abraham was a fascinating personality. He discovers God by himself through the power of his own investigation and his intellectual inquiry. And that was his discovery of Hashem. But that is not important for the story. It's important for the historical record. So if you want to know the historical record of Abraham, go buy the Medrash, right? That's where you'll get the historical record. What is incorporated in the Torah is what is the story? What is our story? What is the story of the Jewish people? And especially with Abraham, where we're starting the Jewish nation, it's important to establish what is the foundation of our relationship with Hashem. And here, there could be two philosophies. The first philosophy is, what's the foundation of the relationship with Hashem? It's based on understanding. And that's why you first have to understand the greatness of Hashem. You have to understand and analyze the importance of the Torah, understand the meaning and significance of the commandments, and that's the foundation. And once you do, you can move to practice. That's one theory. I mean, that's a popular theory. No point of doing a mitzvah before you understand the purpose of that mitzvah. So what the Rebbe says is, if that were the case, then it would be very important to tell us about Abraham. Look, the first Jew discovered God on his own, had a relationship with God that was founded upon logic, and we should do the same. Implying that we should do the same. But the Torah doesn't do so. If you read the Torah and you didn't buy the Medrash, and like I said, you have the Bible without the commentary, what do you know? You know the foundation of the Jewish people is Abraham fulfilling a commandment. That's what it is. In other words, Hashem tells him to do something, and he does it. That's the foundation of the commandment. Later, he's going to grow. Later, he's going to understand. Later, he's going to discuss with God and analyze and debate God. That's all wonderful things, but that's not the foundation. And the lesson for us is, what is the foundation for us of serving Hashem? And that's exactly what the Jewish people do at Sinai. Na'aseh v'nishma. First we will do, then we will hear. And that is why the Torah deliberately does not tell you about Abraham's self-discovery of God, because that would distract from what Hashem, from what our foundation of serving Hashem is. Now I'll give you a practical application of this idea, but before that, also a philosophical point. So the Rebbe's idea is like this: if you understand the relationship with God as one that the human being could really grasp godliness, then you would say, okay, founding our relationship with God based on logic is rational. But if you're coming from the perspective that God is infinite and man is finite, then no amount of understanding and inquiry could get us to the degree to be able to understand infinity, to bridge the gap between the finite and the infinite. And therefore, there really is no way to create the foundation, to create the bridge, other than doing it, following the instructions in the manual that God gives us. And that's why you cannot come closer to God as a foundational principle through wisdom, because wisdom itself will leave us in the realm of being finite, and we can't break free of that to connect to the infinite unless we go beyond ourselves. And that's the philosophical interpretation of why the foundation of being Jewish is to do. You also have to understand, because you have to incorporate every part of your body. So a secondary level is, yes, try to understand what you're doing, but that's not the foundation. And that's why we omit the beginning, the biography of Abraham. And of course, when the Rebbe taught this, you have to be very careful when the Rebbe was talking, because you never knew if he's talking Torah, which he was, but he's maybe also talking current events. And he also may be addressing political trends. And when the Rebbe talked this talk, he was, of course, addressing the invention of the Rebbe, or the Chabad movement, but really the invention of the Rebbe, which was to bring the mitzvah to the street, the mitzvah tank, to stop a Jew and say, well, today is Sukkot, did you shake the lulav today? And there was a lot of pushback, because a lot of people thought that's no way to serve God. Take the guy to yeshiva, enroll him in a course or in a seminar, give him a few weeks lecture of who God is and what creation is and how to prove that God created the world. Later, you tell him about the Torah, and eventually, after he graduates 12 months, you give him a mitzvah. And there were people who did it that way, and there were outreach movements who did it that way. And the Rebbe said you have to flip the whole thing on the head. Forget about, of course, the understanding should follow. Take him to yeshiva is wonderful. Come study Torah is a wonderful mitzvah, one of the most important mitzvahs. But as a foundational principle, the most important thing you can do is stop a Jew and say, you're like Abraham, do a mitzvah. And that is the foundation through which a Jew could connect to the infinity of God, and everything else that follows, that comes after that, everything else follows that foundational commitment. So that is the Hasidic, mystical, philosophical reason why the Torah deliberately omits the biography. So that I think is nice, at least to see it in the context of when the Rebbe talked about taking the mitzvah to the street. It wasn't just a PR tactic, but there was also a deep philosophical idea behind this, and demonstrating that this is not just due to the circumstances because we can't do it's because it's much harder to get somebody to enroll in a yeshiva. It's easier to give a woman Shabbos candles. That is not why we're doing this. We're doing this because we believe that this should be the foundation, and everything else should follow. I heard a terrible story that somebody told me firsthand, that he went to a yeshiva in Israel and he was becoming close to Judaism, and he was in yeshiva for 3 months studying Talmud before someone asked him to put on tefillin. Right? It's just impossible to happen if from the Chabad perspective, because the foundation is, of course, the mitzvah, the actual practice, and everything else, the actual submitting to God and the understanding follows. So that's just closing business from last week, and now we can begin. We go back to the beginning of the journey. Go ahead, Steve.
I think you're using the word philosophical and philosophy loosely.
Yes.
You could substitute that with psychological and psychology, and I think your meaning will not change that. No.
Correct. When I say Steve is addressing, since we have a philosopher here, Steve is addressing my use of the term philosophy, and I what's the word I'm looking for? I confess that, I'm using it loosely. I'm using it in the sense that we use it as in Hasidic philosophy, as in the theory behind the practice. In other words, not just the Torah could be what to do. A lot of the Torah is law, what to do. And then you start thinking about what is the philosophy, what is the inner thinking of the inner system of logic that leads to these results. But I'm not going to get into a philosophical discussion about what philosophy is, because it's a way above my pay grade, and I'm not a philosopher. And I'm using the term philosophy loosely.
One question we want to ask you.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think you said that the first time that the Torah cited that person died in a particular location. Correct?
Yes, that was not critical to the actual story. Yes.
No, the only what came into my mind was that Hevel. He died.
Yeah, but so Hevel died in a certain place. Doesn't tell you where he died. Doesn't say location. It doesn't. And over there, Hevel was different because Hevel is critical to the story. The murder, if there's a murder scene, you have to tell the murder scene. Here, it seems like there's no interpretation. There's no reason, so it's alluding to something else. Okay, I want to go back. That's our custom, right? We have to keep the pattern. Before we go forward, we go back. Let's go back to page 52, 53 really. And this is the story of the journey of Avram, really to be accurate, and his father Terach, traveling from their birthplace, traveling toward Israel, toward the land of Canaan. And all of a sudden they get stuck in Haran. Something happened here. It's not exactly clear. The Torah is trying to signal something. We're not sure what. We will see what's happening here. So if you look at chapter 11, verse 31, which is the first page, if you have the Stone edition, it's page 53. Terach, which was Abraham's father, took his son Abraham and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of Abraham his son, and they departed with them from Ur Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. This is before we have the commandment of Hashem. Commandment of Hashem is Lech Lecha, right? God never spoke to anybody. They're living in Ur Kasdim. They say, we don't want to be in Ur Kasdim, we're moving. Where are we moving to? The Torah tells you where they want to go, right? We have their itinerary. Their itinerary was they depart from Ur Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. They arrived in Haran and they settled there. So they did not conclude their journey. Rashi does the math. Rashi does the math and says they were 60 years in Haran. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Wrong Rashi. I made a mistake, wrong Rashi. Doesn't say how long. Rashi doesn't say how long they were where they were, but it's clear that they settled there. Vayeshvu sham, they sat there. Every year at Sukkah, when we talk about the making of the blessing, Leished Basukkah, to sit in the Sukkah, I always say, because people always ask, do you have to sit in the Sukkah to make the blessing? And the answer is no, because in biblical Hebrew, I just said this Friday night, biblical Hebrew, to sit is to dwell. When the Torah says for 7 days you should dwell, you should sit in the Sukkah, Teishvu Basukkah, you should dwell in the Sukkah. It means you should sit in the Sukkah. It doesn't mean sit. In modern Hebrew, you use lashevet to sit. You don't use lashevet to dwell. It doesn't work in modern Hebrew. But in biblical Hebrew, it's clear that sitting in the Sukkah is dwelling in the Sukkah. And here you see it right here. Where is it? Vayeshvu sham. Second to last line in the Hebrew. Second to last line in the Hebrew, second to last word, and third to last word, Vayeshvu sham. They came to Haran, Vayeshvu sham, and they sat there. But sat there doesn't just mean they sat down to rest from the walk, but it means they settled there. Now, why did they settle there? Why didn't they go to Canaan? I don't know. The Torah doesn't say, right? They were headed to Canaan, but they got stuck in Haran. Then we discussed this last week. Terach passes away. The days of Terach were 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. We discussed this last week. It's really out of order because we don't want to amplify the fact that Abraham left his father. He only did so by divine commandments. And then, right after chapter 11, we go to chapter 12. You turn the page. This is the famous beginning of the journey. That what? Hashem said to Abraham, go for yourself from your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you to the land that I will show you. In other words, God is saying, go to the land that I will show you. He doesn't know, we don't know where it is. That's another discussion of why Hashem doesn't tell him where to go. But that's another discussion. We'll get to that later. But we know the end of the story, that when he ends up being in Canaan, Hashem says, this is the land that I promised to your descendants. So in other words, Hashem's commandment finishes the journey that Terach began. And now the question is, why does Terach stop? And why did Terach leave? So that's the question. We want to figure out what was going on in their mind. And of course, since we are we philosophers, Steve? I don't know if we're philosophers, but certainly we're trying to figure out the deeper meaning and the psychology. What's the message to us? And so the conventional interpretation goes something like this. Avram was being persecuted in Ur Kasdim, as we discussed last week. The word Ur means fire, or either means fire or sun or related. And basically the people were serving the fire. And according to the Medrash, they throw Avram into the fiery pit, or they threatened to throw Avram into the fiery pit. So basically the family says, we have to get out of here. It's not a good place for us. We can't live here in peace based on our beliefs. So they leave and they decide they want to go to Canaan. But they get to Haran, and Haran is comfortable. There's no persecution, so they can live in Haran. And they settle in Haran. Then Hashem says, no, you missed the point. It's not that you left, you weren't supposed to, it's not just that I need you out of Ur Kasdim. I really need Abraham to be in Canaan, in the promised land. And therefore God says, finish the journey, go to Canaan, because as far as they were concerned, they found the peace and serenity, relative peace and serenity in Haran, and they settled there. Right? How many people in the 20th century, they planned to go to one place, and before you know it, they got stuck there and they settled there for 100 years. And that's just the way it is. They got comfortable. And God therefore says, go to Canaan, really confirming the original plan, even though he doesn't say go to Canaan, but it's confirming the original plan. Okay, I saw a beautiful Hasidic Kabbalistic commentary from a 16th century sage living in Tzfat. He wrote a book called Sror Hamor, and he says like this, he says, what's the lesson to us? So I'm going to try to quote the language of the sages. The language of the sages is as follows. If you come close to God, Hashem will help you. In other words, sometimes Hashem waits for you to take the first step. But when you take the first step, Hashem will help you do more than you would be able to do on your own. And there's all kinds of medrashim that say the same thing. On Fridays, we're studying the Song of Songs. And we're up to one of my favorite parts of the song, where the man is knocking on the door and he tells the woman, Pitzchi li, open up the door for me. And she doesn't open. That's another story. I got to come back Friday. But the bottom line is on that verse, the Medrash says that Hashem says, Pitzchi li kechuda shel machat, open up for me the size of the eye of a needle. right? So just open up a little bit. And then God says, "V'ani eftach lachem," and I will open up for you the size of the opening of the ulam. The ulam was the hall in the Temple of Solomon, which was tremendous. It was never closed, and it was always open. I forget the dimensions. It could be 40 by 80. It was a cubit, so it was a very big opening. So basically, what the sages keep saying is, Hashem doesn't ask you to purify yourself completely. You can't do that. You need divine help. But what Hashem wants is you take the first step. So open up a little bit, and if you open up a little bit, then God will do the rest. We find this also. There's also a very very interesting Hasidic interpretation. I think it's from the Getter Rebbe. He says this about the story of the daughter of Pharaoh. The daughter of Pharaoh, she sees Moshe in the Nile, and she stretches out her hands, and she brings the basket in, and it turns out to be Moses. So it's well known that there's two interpretations of what that word means. What does she stretch forth? Amata. Amata can mean her arm. Amata can also mean her maid. And then there's a medrash, there's a dat amata, there's a whole interpretation which basically says a miracle happens. What's the miracle? She stretches out her arm. Did you ever hear this medrash? She stretches out her arm. It wasn't long enough, so God makes a miracle that the arm becomes longer. So what this Hasidic teaching says is Hashem will not, she didn't know that the miracle will happen, right? She's the daughter of Pharaoh. She doesn't know miracle will happen. So why does she stretch out her hand if she can't reach the child? Well, in hindsight, we know God will make the miracle, the arm will stretch. Why is she stretching out her hand? And the lesson, of course, is you have to do your part. And if you do your part, God will do the rest. So you see this all over the rabbinic and Hasidic literature. Going back to the 16th century, the Kabbalist, his name was Rabbi Avraham Saba. He says like this, he says, God would not tell Abraham to go and fulfill his destiny in the land of Canaan until Abraham and Terach, really, until they start the journey on their own, right? They started searching, they left Haran, they're looking, they say, I want to go somewhere, I want to change, I want to better my environment. I think I should go to Canaan. Once they go, then God comes in and says, you know what, if you go, I promise you, you'll be blessed. And all the people, you'll be successful. All the people of the world will bless themselves by you, etc., etc. But that happens in response to what you have to try to do on your own. You try to do on your own, and then God comes in. Go ahead.
I hope I'm not asking you to repeat yourself, but Haran is Abram's brother.
Yeah, Lot, the son of Haran, correct.
And it's also a place.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Haran is tricky. There is a place and a name, but in English it's the same because they make the hey and the chet equal. In the Hebrew, Haran with a chet is the place. Haran is the brother of Abraham. Haran could mean, you want to talk about Haran. Haran has a meaning. The Medrash keeps saying that Haran is a place. The word Haran comes from the word wrath. We say it in the second paragraph of the Shema. V'chara af Hashem b'chem, the wrath of God will flare up against you. So Charon Af, the Medrash says that Charon Af, Charon is a place where the wrath of God is there. And that's why God says you have to leave. And in general, we see in the story of Abraham, even though it's complicated, we want to go back to Abraham tells his descendants to go back to Haran and marry someone from his family. But in general, the broader population, they may have not been as bad as Ur Kasdim, but there was also idol worship, and therefore there is the wrath of God over there. On the other, that's Haran. That's what the sages say. You don't need my speculation of what Haran means. Haran could be much more positive. Haran could be either from the word mountain, which in Kabbalistic literature represents love. Aaron dies on Hor Hahar. Aaron's name has Har in it. Aharon, Aleph, Har, Nun. Number one, which represents God. Har is mountain, and Nun, the final Nun extends beneath the line. So Har represents mountain. Haran could also mean giving birth or being pregnant. That's the word batahar. That word is related to giving birth, and therefore we see that Haran Haran is really. Last week we gave him bad PR, but he's really an interesting figure. He did really sacrifice himself for at least submit himself to death for the sake of God. Now he may have done so after hedging, after seeing what happened to Abraham, but it's clear, seems clear that Haran is much more positive, even in the makeup of his name, much more positive than the place of Haran. And like I said, Haran, what I said about Haran is speculation, but what I said about Haran, the wrath of God, that is in the sages. Okay. We'll take a quick question. We got to go because we want to keep the class flowing. And what we're gonna do is, because we have people online and in person, it gets a little confusing. Maybe we'll do every now and then we'll stop for questions, and then we'll be able to flow, get a little chunk of information, and then we can do questions. But I'll take a question from Vicky, and then we'll take a 25-minute drive down the highway, and then we'll be a pit stop for questions and to recharge your Teslas and fill up gas, whatever you do, whatever you like to do. Go ahead, Vicky.
Yes, I had a quick question. Whose idea was to go to Canaan? I mean, did somebody tell that? Was it Terach's or?
It seems like it's Terach, because the person being active here in the verse, if you look at the verse, the person being active is Terach, right? If you look at verse Vayikach Terach, verse 31, Terach took a son Abraham. Now the question is, why does Terach take a son Abraham? According to the Medrash, Terach is the guy who really informs the king about his troublemaking son Abraham. So I think what happens is that Terach first is invested in the society, but then when he sees, and therefore he also really tells the king about my troublemaking son. But at some point, when he sees that the son, when the king tries to kill Abraham, at some point, because sometimes when the persecution comes personally into his own home, at some point it seems like he's disillusioned by the society. I don't know we know that eventually he does teshuvah. I don't know if he did teshuvah at this point, but the bottom line is when he sees what's happening to his son, and especially his other son, who was killed. So I think at some point he's disillusioned by the government and by the society, by the persecution, by the not tolerating other ideas. And even though initially he's embedded within that society and a high-ranking member, and therefore he hopes the king will pressure his son Abraham a little bit to get him off these reckless ideas so he can get back within the society. But at some point he sees, as happens sometimes, I guess, that when he feels the persecution of the kingdom on his own, he is disillusioned. So he says, let's get out of here. That's what it seems to me.
That seems to me too, because it's not a teshuvah, but that was his idea, or contrasting to the Abraham, where Hashem says, go to the land where I show you. He doesn't even name the Canaan, but Terach has an idea where to go, right?
Terach has an idea, but again, remember that what we started in the beginning saying, that everything up into the third portion, everything until chapter 12 is what people did on their own, right? Chapter 12, we're reserving chapter 12 for when I want to understand the Jewish people. What is the foundation? What's the first thing I need to know? And the answer is, you need to know that you have to follow God's commandment. The fact that Terach first had a great idea to go to Canaan is a wonderful idea, but that's not why we do it, right? A similar concept you see about the 10 Commandments. One of the questions about the 10 Commandments is that God brings all the Jewish people together at the mountain, at the foot of the mountain, with thunder and lightning. And what does he tell them? He tells them simple things that you could figure out on your own. The Talmud says that if the Torah would not have been given, we would learn some of the 10 Commandments just from looking at nature. We would learn Geza, for example. We would learn Geza. We would learn the prohibition of theft from the ants. The ants on the floor. I've never been to an ant colony. I see they're very busy. I don't want to interfere. But apparently, they don't steal from each other. That's what the Talmud says. So in other words, by looking at nature, you could find the qualities that are values that you should emulate. So really, what the Talmud is saying, you don't really need God to come and tell you the 10 Commandments. That's what it seems to be saying. So then why does God tell it to us? Why isn't it enough? If we would have learned it from the ant, why don't we learn it from the ant? Why do we need God to tell it to us? So there's all kinds of interpretations. But one interpretation is, now when we do it because God told it to us. If God wanted to do it only because we understand it, then we would see it in nature, observe it in nature, and that would be enough. In other words, we would logically come to a conclusion that the best society would be one where, for our own benefit, would be one where people respect each other's possessions. We would have reached that conclusion, but that's not a relationship with God, like we're saying over here. So Terach had an idea. Let's go to Canaan. That's a wonderful idea. He didn't finish the idea, but it's a nice idea. but that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because God told us to do it. And that's really how we think about Judaism, at least from the Hasidic perspective. I'm sure the philosophers would disagree, but I'm biased. So what are you going to do?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, let's think about now some of the details here, even before we continue. Lech lecha, go to yourself. We can deal with that in a second. Lech lecha, go to you. So let's deal with that for a moment. Lech lecha, let's go to you. So everybody knows that all the rabbis like talking about this, and all the commentaries, like all the commentators like talking about it. Lech lecha, go to you. Before we even know that what the answer is, we have to establish whether or not there's a question. And like everything else is a debate, whether or not it's a question. In other words, is this form of speech common or not common in biblical Hebrew? Lech lecha, go to you. Rashi addresses this question and he says, Lahana'atcha l'tovatcha, go for your benefit and for your pleasure and for your good. In other words, when I say go for you, what does it mean go for you? Because it's a tricky word. Licha, li could also mean to. So usually we say go somewhere, go to this place. But it doesn't say go to this place. Go to you. What does it mean go to you? So two could be geographical, go to you, but two can also mean go in order to achieve something. Go to the store. It could mean go to learn. It could mean go to a place and learn, or it means that's the purpose of why you're going. You're going to learn. So here, Rashi says, Lech lecha, go to you, is an unusual form of Hebrew, of biblical Hebrew. And therefore, Rashi says, when it says go for you, it means go for your benefits. And that's why Hashem says in verse number 2, I'm going to make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. That is the interpretation of the word to you, because otherwise we have a grammatical problem of what's to you. So Rashi says it means for your benefit. Other people disagree. Ramban, for example, says it's no problem. He quotes a few verses in the Bible where it says go to you, and it's not a problem. For example, in Song of Songs. Now I'm sorry, I'm invested in the Song of Songs now, but Rashi quotes Ramban. I saw the Ramban last night. He quotes the Song of Songs, which says the Hageshem Chalaf halach lo. The rain departed and went to it. If the rain can go to it, Abraham can go to himself. In other words, that's just the way you speak the language. Let me find the verse if I can for a moment. In other words, Nachmanides says I don't need Rashi's answer because it's not really a question. But if there's no question, there's no sermon. So the rabbis are not happy. So we're going to follow what Rashi says. Okay, if you want to see, you don't have to look. But it's in Song of Songs, page in the Art Scrolls 1264. So this is Anadaidi. This is the beloved telling his beloved young girl. He says like this. He talks about, let's go hang out. He says the winter has passed, the rain is gone. Now is a wonderful time to hang out in the fields. So if you look at verse 11, for example, on page 1264 within chapter 2, verse 11. Okay, you can't read this translation because it's not really a translation. It's not a translation. It's a commentary, so you can't get anything done here. Where am I looking at? Hageshem, verse 11. They're going to botch this up. Here we go. For the winter of bondage has passed. The dulge of suffering is over and gone. This is really sad. It really is sad because they don't translate the verse. They're giving the commentary. What the Hebrew says is as follows: Kine astav avar. The stav is like the frost. The frost has passed. The geshem, the rain, chalaf, passed, went to it. Halach lo, went to it. The rain went to it. What does it mean it went to it? What goes to it? Right, I'm looking at, if you want to see the Hebrew, it's in verse Yud Aleph. So it's exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mess it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The 12th line from the top, the first word is lo, to it. The rain passed and went to it. What does it mean the rain went to it? So the Ramban, Nachmanides says, don't get bent out of shape. That's biblical Hebrew. So the rain bent out of the rain went to it, and Abraham went to him. Where are you going? To you. So Ramban says, let's not get too carried away. However, the later commentaries, I'm going to quote from the Kliyaka, one of my favorite commentaries, because he's also a Kabbalist and also someone very invested in the Pshat, in the simple interpretation. He says, one second, he doesn't agree with Ramban, with Nachmanides. And he's going to deal with Nachmanides' proof. And what he says, something beautiful. He says, going to go to you, lech lecha, go to you. He says, Rashi says it's to you means for your benefit, but he says a more simple interpretation is whenever the verse says go to your source, it's go to you. Go inward, go to your source. And he deals with each of the, I think, 3 or 4 examples that Nachmanides quotes, which I can check it up here, but I don't remember offhand. And he says the verse is using that language because it's going to its source. The rain is going back to its source. That's why the verse can use the term Hageshem halach halach lo. The rain went to it. Where did it go? It went back to its source. And he brings the 3, 4 examples of Nachmanides to say that the term lech lecha, it's always used in the context of going back to its source. So when God tells Abraham, lech lecha, go to your source, it means go to your source. Now, this is very interesting because you could say spiritually go to your source. We'll deal with that in a minute. But the Kli Yakar says that you're actually going back to your source. Where is that? Why so? Even in the physical sense. Because we know that God formed Adam. He formed Adam dust from the earth. That's what the verse says. Says the Talmud, or maybe the Medrash, I don't remember. Where did he get the earth from? Where did he get the earth from? So there's all different interpretations. One interpretation is that God collected earth from all corners of the earth. Why? Because if somebody dies in the Far East, you want him to be a native of the earth in that area, so the earth should accept him. The person dies in South America. He has to be a native to every place. So Adam was created from earth, which is a collection from everywhere. There's another Medrash that doesn't have to disagree. Maybe it's both. But the other Medrash says a man was created from the place of his atonement. In other words, man was created from the earth on the Temple Mountain. That's where we come from. So the Kli Yakar says when God tells Abraham, lech lecha, go back to you, it doesn't just mean in the psychological sense, which is go back to the core of your soul. It means that too. But it also means in the very physical sense, go back to the place where man was taken from, which is ultimately the Temple Mountain. But he doesn't tell him the Temple Mountain yet, and we're going to deal with that in a minute. The Kli Yakar also says that if you look, I forgot that commentary, but he says, look what I wrote earlier. When man was sent away from the Garden of Eden, the verse says as follows. If you look at, you don't have to look, you could trust me if you want to. If you don't want to, it's also good, no problem. I always had a teacher who would say, when there was a reference in the Talmud, he would say, don't save your blind faith for this. You got to check it out by yourself. You'll save your faith for other matters. So if you want to you don't want to spend your faith on trusting me, you could look in, but if you want to trust me, it's also good. Whatever you want, free country. In any case, verse 23 on page 18, so it's Genesis chapter 3, verse 18. Verse 23, page 18, page 19, really in English. But it's Genesis chapter 3, verse 18. Man, after God says, okay, we got to expel Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden because now they know good from bad, and now they're going to perhaps take from the tree of life. So you have an interesting verse 23. So Hashem, God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the soil from which he was taken. To work the ground, where he was taken from. So you could read this simply, go work the land. We were taken from the land. Kli Yakar says, no. God is sending man out of the Garden of Eden on a journey. And where's the journey going to end? The land where you were taken from. Where was Abraham taken from? From the Mount Moriah, from the Temple Mountain. Now, it may take a few generations until Adam's descendants get to Mount Moriah, which is Abraham. But that's what he's saying. So go to you. He says you can really, not just psychological, it's that too. But he leaves that for the Hasidic interpretations to elaborate. But he says it's even literal. We want to go back to the Temple Mountain. This is a journey toward the Temple Mountain. Okay, now it gets more interesting because it's all still in the Kli Yakar. I'm not saying anything fresh here. I'm not saying anything original yet. Let's look at the story of Abraham. The story of Abraham really covers primarily 2 parshas. It covers the parsha of Lech Lecha, this third parsha of the Torah, and the following one, Vayera. After that, Abraham is pretty much out of the picture, even though he's still alive. In the beginning of the third parsha of Abraham, it discusses how he purchases a burial spot for Sarah in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron, and then how he dispatches Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac. But primarily, we have two portions about Abraham. What is so interesting? So what's the beginning and the end? The beginning is God tells Abraham, go to Lech Lecha, go to yourself, go for yourself, go to the land of Israel. That's the beginning. What's the final portion of Abraham? Anybody remember the final test, of course? The Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Now, where's the binding of Isaac? To the Mount Moriah. Now, what's interesting is that it's clear. I thought only the modern commentaries caught on to this, but it's obviously the earlier commentators were also paying attention when they read the Torah. And what's fascinating is that the beginning of the commandment to go to the land of Israel and the beginning of the commandment to go to Mount Moriah have the same word. And it's the only place in the Torah that uses this term. So it's clear that the Torah is trying to link the first commandment that we read about Abraham together with the last commandments. So let's take a look. Vayomer Hashem al Avram, page in article 55, in the Hebrew 54. Vayomer Hashem al Avram. Hashem said to Avram, go for yourself, lech lecha, which is the phrase we're trying to deal with and trying to analyze. Lech lecha, go to yourself. We'll deal with from where to go to. We'll deal with that another time. But lech lecha. So God says lech lecha. And then let's read the verse. I need the end of the verse. So I'm sorry. I'm going to go back. Go for yourself. You see, it's interesting. The article is translating it based on Rashi. Rashi says lech lecha, go to yourself means go to your benefit. Go for your benefits. So they translated go for yourself. For as in for your benefits. But let's continue. From your land, from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. El haaretz asher areka, the land that I will show you. Remember, I'm going to jump ahead. The Hasidic commentaries say, what does it mean, the land that I will show you? What is he showing? So the conventional interpretation is the land that I will show you, I'll show you the land. But the Hasidic interpretation is, the poetic interpretation is, the land where I will show you. Who is being shown? Abraham is being shown. You will achieve self-discovery in that land. So you got to go to the land that I will show you, referring to, but before we even go there, I want the phrase. We have lech lecha, go to yourself, and we have the land asher areka, the land that I will show you. Now we're going to turn to the Akedah, which is on page 100, or 101 in the article in the English, which is very Kabbalistic because according to the Kabbalah, 100 is complete. 101 goes beyond the logic, and that's really what the Akedah is, going beyond the logic, right? So maybe it's by divine providence, or maybe by the designer's providence, that the Akedah should be on page 101. By the way, when in the early 1950s, there were terrible terror attacks all over Israel. Before the Sinai War, before the Sinai campaign in 1956. And there was terror attacks all over the place, including a terrible attack in Kfar Chabad, in the Chabad village, where 5 students and their teacher were killed one night. Terrible tragedy. And then, at some point, they decided they have to put the terror to rest. So they got Arik Sharon, who was, of course, everybody knows who he was, and he created this guerrilla group. And they did all kinds of controversial things. I'm not now going to give an endorsement one way or the other. But they really changed the entire philosophy of the defense in Israel. They took from defense to offense. Go read about him. The bottom line is the name of his group was 101. So it was sort of going beyond. So that's why I just thought of 101. So that's what he was called. Later it was merged with the paratroopers, but before that it was 101. The bottom line is, let's read the verse of the Akedah. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, okay, that's verse 1. Tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he replied, here I am. Verse 2 is the key verse here. And he said, please take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. You ready? The lech lecha, and go. Oh, okay. You see, the English just botches the whole thing up. They translate, and go to the land of Moriah. That's not what it says. Lech lecha, go to yourself. El eretz haMoriah, to the land of Moriah. Bring him up there as an offering upon one of the mountains, which I shall show you. Same word. No, it's not the same word. It's not the same word. I retract. But lech lecha, it's clear, right? In the English, they don't preserve that that phrase. I don't know why. It's a beautiful phrase, right? Lech lecha. So it's the only two places where it says lech lecha in the Torah. The beginning of Abraham's journey on page 54, where God tells Abraham, lech lecha me'arzcha, go to yourself from your land. And then 2 parshas later, he's 75 here, and here he's 136. No, he was born 100. He's 137 years old. So it's quite a chunk of time later. And here, the same phrase. All of a sudden, and God spoke to Abraham many times, told him to do many things. Never lech lecha. Mount Moriah. You're going to Mount Moriah. Lech lecha, go to yourself. So the Kli Yakar says, oh, look what's happening here. Lech lecha you use when you're going back to your source. And before we even get to the philosophy or psychology or spirituality or within the human soul, we're saying he's giving him a physical journey. We are going to end up in Mount Moriah, but you're going to start going to yourself toward the land that I will show you. Self-discovery show you. And where will it be culminated? It will be culminated with the binding of Isaac, where you're actually going to go to the mountain Mount Moriah. Why he doesn't tell it to him immediately? Kli Yakar deals with that in a second, but we'll deal with that in a second. So that's the beautiful connecting the beginning of Abraham's journey to self-discovery, but to the source of self. But the source of self is even physical, even on a physical sense, going to the geographical location where we were taken from. Now, I cannot say this. I think he doesn't really say it, but I'm going to help him out, the Kli Yakar, because I like him so much. I'm kidding. I'm sorry for being so arrogant, but I'm going to help him out and try to explain what he's saying is, in some sense, you're going back to going back to your source. What's your source? What's the source of the soul? The source of the soul is when the soul is bound up with Hashem. Where is the closest place in the Torah? At least traditionally. Now people don't like the Akedah. The Akedah gets a bad rap. We'll deal with that when we get there. But traditionally understood, what's Avram's greatest devotion to God? Complete suspension of self, complete devotion to Hashem. Where did that happen? Where is he bound up with his source like no other time in his lifetime? At the binding of Isaac at Mount Moriah. So at that scene, he came back to his source. Number one, physically, his body came. In other words, I'm a descendant of Abraham, so our bodies are descendants of Abraham, taken from the earth, the place of our atonement, the place of Mount Moriah. So physically, he comes back to that space. But it's not only physically, it's also spiritually and emotionally, because that's where he is completely self devoted to Hashem, as the soul was when it was in its source, completely devoid of any ego and sense of self, and just bonding with Hashem. So it's a beautiful story. The way the Kli Yakar says it, we're going back to our source, and that's lech lecha, and that's why all the other places that I don't have the time for the grammar right now, but all the other places, actually I do have it, I think I copied it. All the places that, I don't know if you copied all of them, all the places that Nachmanides quotes in the Torah, and other places in the Bible where it says something goes back to it, Kli Yakar says it's always going back to its source. And Abraham is also going back to its source, and it shows so beautifully how the beginning of the story and the end of the story is really one story. It's really one continuous journey toward going to Mount Moriah. Now, there's also one more verse that proves this point that he quotes, is later on, Abraham comes into Israel from the north. Let's find the verse. It's verse 9, page 57, verse 9, before he goes to Egypt. Then Abraham journeyed on, journeying steadily toward the south. Page 57 in the Art Scroll. This is still in the first paragraph. As soon as he gets to Israel, he's coming for Shechem, and then God tells him, this is the place where you're going to be. This is the place that I promised to your descendants. Verse 8, he goes from Shechem, he goes southward to Bethel. From there, he relocated to the mountain east of the Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And he built there an altar to Hashem and invoked Hashem by name. But he's coming, the direction, he's moving southward. Then Abraham journeyed on, journeying steadily toward the south. What's toward the south? What's south of where he's coming from? South of Bethel certainly is Jerusalem. So the Kli Yakar says he's coming into Israel, but he keeps going. Over decades, he's moving south and south. Eventually, he's going to reach Mount Moriah. In other words, it's a continuous journey. In the beginning of the journey, even before anything else happens, we're telling you what's the trajectory of the journey. He's coming into the land of Israel. toward the land of Israel, to his source, eventually Har Moriah, eventually Mount Moriah. So that's the Kli Yakar, which I really liked. I really liked it. And if I was a little bit more of a poet, so you could really write a whole story of sort of putting the Avram's entire story in that context of going back to your source, continuous journey. And finally, the scene of the Akedah is he's back to himself. Not to himself, I would say to his source. He's back to his source, both physically and psychologically and mentally as well. Now we have to deal with one more question, which is, why doesn't God tell him? Why doesn't God say, look, you got to go to your source. You got to go to Mount Moriah. What's the problem? Why does he not tell him? First of all, he doesn't tell him when he's outside of Israel. He said, the land that I will show you. And even in the story of the Akedah, actually there he does say, it doesn't say the exact mountain, but he does say, go to the Mount Moriah. So let's see how the Kli Yakar deals with this. Let's see if he says something that I could understand.
But even psychologically, if a person goes to himself, he needs to do it himself.
You have to go to yourself. Yeah. You have to. So you're saying self-discovery. That's very good. That's a psychological answer. Self-discovery. A person has to. You have to go through the process yourself. You can't just. It can't be given to you. You have to make your. You
cannot outsource that.
Right. You have to do the journey. Okay. This is nice. This is nice. Okay, this guy's poetic, so I'm going to try my best without botching this thing up. He says like this. He says, it's known that the Talmud says that all the prophets, the prophets did not prophesy outside of Israel. All the prophets prophesied in Israel. I know you're going to ask me questions, but this is the quote. Except there's a little wiggle room. They said either in Israel or concerning Israel. All right, so sometimes be outside of Israel, which is interesting that the Kli Yakar doesn't address it, but other people address it. In the beginning of this parsha, it says, "Vayemer Hashem l'Avram," God spoke to Avram. What it doesn't say is God appeared to Avram. Later on in this parsha, many times it's going to say, in Avram's lifetime, multiple times it says, Hashem appears to Abraham. Here, Hashem didn't appear to him. It's just a voice. A voice just spoke. Voice is not as great of a revelation as God appearing, because you have two senses. You have the ability to listen, hear, and then you have the ability to see. And in Hebrew, when you say God appears, like in English, Vayera is literally the same word as seeing. So if you say God appears, meaning I could see it, which means that the revelation is much more vivid. I'm not a prophet, so I can't tell you. Maimonides discusses the 10 levels of prophecy in the Guide to the Perplexed. I'm going to confess, I don't fully understand him. I'm not a prophet. But the bottom line is, it's clear that when you say Avram, when you say that Hashem appeared to him, it's a much greater level of revelation. So they say, well, how come here Hashem did? Because it's outside of Israel. In Israel, he gets the full revelation. So we understand that you have to be so what the Kli Yakar says, in the beginning, Hashem doesn't want to tell him this great secret of what is the source of the body and the soul when he's outside of Israel, until he enters Israel and he gets more spiritually connected. And he quotes the Tanchuma that the Nevuah prophecy does not rest outside of Israel. And therefore, and this is where I think it's so beautiful. It's not just a technicality. He says like this: as long as he was outside of Israel, before he gets the true spirit of prophecy, he will never understand the true essence of the soul, which is sourced in Har Moriah. So what are you going to tell Abraham? By the way, go to the land which is the source of your soul. God doesn't just say it. If he says that, it means Abraham is capable of understanding what the source of the soul is. He's not ready. He's not capable of understanding that level yet. And therefore, part of this discovery is understanding what the source of the soul, what is my essence. And therefore, he doesn't tell him what the final destination is, because at this point, he's not capable of understanding it. And only once he came into Israel, and then he comes closer to God. Now, 2 portions later, when it comes to the Mount Moriah, here God right away already tells him what the source is. He says, you're going, Lech lecha l'Eretz HaMoriah, you're going to go to the land of Moriah, because that's your source. Because now you're able to understand what the essence of the soul is, and therefore that you're going to your source. Okay, later I'll tell you exactly which mountain to go to. But right away he tells him, you're already going to go to the land of Moriah. So in that sense, it's a journey on multiple levels. And you can't reveal the journey, the destination, ultimate destination right away. Not only because, like Vicky says, you have to discover it on their own, which is true, but also because God is not going to talk to Abraham about a certain level or state of being, which he's not capable of understanding yet. So the beauty of the story is that it's multi-layered, and the Torah gives you just enough information by using the same term, Lech Lecha, in the beginning and in the end, to tell you this is one story. You have to understand this not as various steps in the journey, but is one destination, beginning at the initial commandment, Lech Lecha, go to yourself, culminating when you reach your source, which is not sacrificing your child. That's not the point. But the point is complete devotion to God. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about the phrase "Invoked Hashem by name."
Yes.
And I'm recalling, I think it was Hashem speaking to Moses, saying they knew me by as El Shaddai.
Yeah.
And I also see in the Hebrew that they're using Hashem.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's going on here with names?
So what is going on with names is a wonderful question. Names, Hashem. What is the meaning of the word Hashem? So obviously we know there's at least 7 names of Hashem. Then there's other titles. Every name represents a various expression of Hashem. So there's the essence, and the essence is unknowable. A name is an expression, and the name gives you some information about Hashem. So what does the name Hashem represent? So I'll give you the classical Medrash interpretation, and then we'll give the Hasidic, which could be understood as one and the same, but it's just uncovering another layer. Rashi, the first Rashi of the Torah, the first verse of the Torah, Rashi says there's in the beginning God created. Bereshit bara Elokim. In the beginning of creation says Elokim. So Rashi says Elokim is an attribute of justice. And then later Rashi says on Shabbat it says Hashem Elokim. After the 6 days of creation, when it comes to the 7th day, it introduces Hashem. And Rashi says that Hashem, actually Rashi says it initially right away, that Hashem is the name of Racham and compassion. So it's different names. Abraham is saying the compassionate God. But the way the Kabbalists read this exact statement of the Medrash, that compassion and judgment is synonymous with limitation and revelation. Because judgment means you hold back, you only give what the person is deserving for. And compassion means you give more than the person is deserving for. According to the Kabbalah, the level of Hashem is the transcendent, the one who transcends nature. So Elokim, this is written in the Code of Law. When you say in prayer, Elokim means the one, the powerful, the all-powerful, the one who creates nature, and therefore all power within nature is attributed to God. That's Elokim. What is Hashem? Hashem is the attribute of God that transcends nature, and it's alluded to in the word that the word Yud Kei Vav Kei. What does Hashem mean? What does that word? What does the word mean? Some people think that it means Mehaveh, the one who brings into existence. Hoveh means exist. Mehaveh is the one who brings it into existence. That is true, but it's not perfect because then the grammar would be a little bit different. You call him Mehaveh, not Yud Hey Vav Hey. What is Yud Hey Vav Hey? The Kabbalists would tell you that it's really a combination of 3 words: past, present, and future. Haya was, Hoveh is, Yihiyeh will be. And we don't have 3 names for God. We have 1, because what we're saying is that one word could contain all 3 tenses, past, present, and future. It's a very simple and unsophisticated way of saying the God that transcends time. And as we know today, that if you transcend time, you transcend everything. You transcend all of nature. Everything in nature is in time and space. So when Avraham is telling people, Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, when he's calling the name of Hashem, what he's telling them is not just that there's various, that they're pagans and they're serving various forces, and there's really, you're serving the wrong one. You should serve. You're speaking to the wrong. Sometimes you go to negotiations. You're a negotiator. I think I will. At some point, someone explained to me that the hard part is to figure out who is the decision maker. Right? You could negotiate with the wrong people, and you're spending time, and you need to figure out who the decision maker is. So it's not just that Abraham is saying, "Don't bow to the stone, go out to God because He's got the power." Abraham is living a paradigm change. All the forces of nature are just forces of nature. The one God transcends all of them, and that's B'Shem Hashem. Now, the word Hashem, calling in the name of Hashem, appears many times in this parasha, and next week, God willing, or the week after, we'll discuss exactly what's happening. And according to the Hasidic interpretation, Avraham is expanding in his relationship with Hashem. And if you look at every time, the way the verse says, it's going to say it 3 times. Well, not really 3, but what he does, how he serves Hashem in the next few verses, in the next few pages, represent Abraham climbing the ladder of devotion to Hashem. So the names are significant, And even though sometimes we just gloss over them, but really every time the name of Hashem does have a lot of meaning, and it's a philosophical shift that he does not call the name of Hashem. And you see this all throughout the Torah. So for example, when Moses confronts Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, Mi Hashem asher eshma b'kolo, who is Hashem that I should hear of this? Never heard of Hashem. You heard of Elohim. Okay, you want to debate who is the most powerful God? Is it Pharaoh? Is it God? Who's got the most power within nature? A Pharaoh is willing to have a debate. But if you come to Pharaoh and you say, this Hashem transcends time, past, present, and future as one. Pharaoh says, I don't talk your language. Go find somebody else to talk to. That's what he says. I don't know what you're talking about. I can't negotiate. And that's what Abraham starts to preach, which is a complete shift from the culture of the time. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Thank you for joining. Now we have 2 minutes left. We're going to take a question from Steve Strake and follow by any other questions. But have a wonderful day and happy Sukkot. And we're finishing the Torah this week, so it's exciting. So I'm going to put a plug from the Thursday class, because the Thursday class is the weekly parsha. So if you want to jump on the horse for the weekly parsha, it's a good time because we're starting the cycle again. So we got to get into shape, and we got to get right in the cycle again. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Steve. Go ahead. That's a good question. It's a good question. Does he say it Hineni? Does he say it Hineni? I don't think he says it anywhere else, but I'll check it up in a second with the help of the technology.
Because going back to philosophy.
Yes.
But a 20th century French philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, maybe you've heard of him.
No.
He was very interesting. I think he was born in Vilna and ended up during the Second World War in France, and he was part of the French army. He was captured by the Germans. Yes, he was a Jew, but he was also a captured French soldier.
Right.
And so he lived throughout that captivity. And Emmanuel Levinas, he was head of many yeshivas in Algeria.
Oh, really?
And so part of his philosophy, I don't understand most of what he writes, because he's writing to other philosophers.
Interesting.
And so when he's writing to other philosophers, I don't understand. But anyhow.
What should we say? If you say that, what are we going to say? Yeah.
Like one of the things in philosophy was you learn thou shalt not kill by looking at a person's fate.
Right.
And the other person's fate tells you that thou shalt kill.
Yeah.
And so one of the commentaries on Emmanuel Levinas, they transferred Hineni into the French "Here I am."
Yeah.
And didn't associate it with the Hebrew Hineni.
Interesting.
And so commentators in Emmanuel Levinas
Missed the point.
they missed many points, and that's one of them.
Okay, so I want to see something about Hineni. Thank you. First of all, I just checked. The word Hineni appears 177 times in the Bible, never in Abram's words, Abram's response to God, only once. There's one other in that conversation. Abram says Hineni afterward to the angel. When the angel says, don't harm your son, Abram says Hineni. And also Yitzchak, on the way to the Akedah, Isaac turns to his father and says, what's going on here? So he says, first he says, Vayemer Yitzchak. Yitzchak tells Abram, calls Abram, Yitzchak says to Abram, his father, and he says, my father, and Abram responds, Vayemer Hineni v'ni, here I am, my son. So Hineni first appears at the Akedah, nowhere else in the context of Abraham talking. It's interesting, he talks to God and to his son. This is a very deep conversation here. Yitzchak said to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. What did he say? Could have just said, Yitzchak said, my father. So some people say that moment, the father and son bonding is the story. And that's where Abraham for the first time says, Hineni, here I am. But going back, coming full circle, when could you say, here I am? Only when you journey back to your essence. Because when you're not in touch with who I really am, when I'm not in touch with my true source, I can't say Hineni, I can't say here I am, because I'm not in touch with my essence. I'm in touch with the external levels of what I want and what I'm looking for. So if you say, if the Kli Yakar says that the journey of Avram from the beginning all the way to the Akedah is a journey about discovering self, so when could you say here I am? Only at the end of the journey. Only once you discovered yourself, now you could say something about here I am. Before that, it wasn't me. I wasn't in touch with the true me. So in that sense, it would be accurate to say, it would be fitting, it would fit the puzzle to say that Avram cannot say Hineni before he discovers the source of self, which is physically being a Mount Moriah, but more importantly, spiritually being back to his source, which is what? Total devotion to Hashem. So thank you for that, Hineni. Wonderful day, everybody. Thank you. No, all good, all good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi. Have a good day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.